Okay, the Trimbles actually came through Kentucky on their way to Ohio. And my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was an early governor of Ohio. His daughter, Eliza Jane Trimble Thompson, was the leader of the Hillsborough Crusade. Crusades in those days meant temperance. There is Moseley, being claimed by the physicists because he died in Gallipoli. I will come back to that as well. But there is Henry Moseley being claimed by the physicists in an article from the American Physical Society monthly newsletter. I'm not sure there's much information there, but whether he was a chemist or a physicist is an issue I will come back to as well. Some of our wonderful anniversaries. The Danes invaded England 1,000 years ago. The publication of Machiavelli's The Prince. You can't actually see this. 200 years since the birth of Wagner and Verdi. And 150 years since Gettysburg, the Emancipation Proclamation. The International Red Cross was founded in the wake of the Crimean War. I remember it well. And the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, which perhaps is what gave scientists the feeling that they should all get government money. Brooklyn Bridge, Wright Brothers, wonderful. There are a bunch more. Sicilian Landing, which my husband participated in. Hillary and Tenzing Norgay climbed Everest 60 years ago. Queen Elizabeth, of course. 50 years ago, the March on Washington, I Have a Dream. The Kennedy assassination, the death of C.S. Lewis, I was reminded earlier this evening. Kenyan independence was that year. The Profumo scandal. This is one of my favorite events of 1963. There was a gal, Mindy Rice Davis, who was said to have been a spy and to have slept with various British government officers to extract information from them. One of them denied even knowing her. Well, he would, wouldn't he, said Mindy Rice Davis. Deny having known her. Things like that happen even now. Okay, here are the centenaries, just a few of them. There are lots more from 1913. The Palace Theater opened. Serious ones. The New York Armory Show that brought modern art to the United States. The premiere in Paris of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. Modern music, and I really did meet Stravinsky late in his life and fairly early in mine. What else? 16th Amendment. Congress may tax incomes. You know about that one, don't you? The first publication of Piltdown Man. It took 40 years to get the truth out. A record temperature. Bohr, Adam, Moseley. We'll come back to Moseley. And Vesto Melvin Slipher. What were his parents thinking of to name him Vesto Melvin? Vesto Melvin Slipher was the first to measure redshifts of galaxies that fed soon after into our understanding that the universe is expanding. Not just Edwin Hubble. There were lots of people involved. That's another talk. Actually, I offered that talk as an alternative for this evening under the title, Anybody But Hubble. And as a few of you may know, he was a Louisville boy, and so that was not a really good title for here. So we're doing Blurring the Boundaries. But Slipher's first redshifts from then. Birkeland, Poincaré, a whole flock of things. Oh yes, the first appearance of the Buffalo nickel was 100 years ago. Now your first quiz question. You understand this is meant to be an American Indian, right? Up in that corner. That animal, what is the real correct name for that animal? Louder. Yes, that's a bison of the Buffalo nickel, yes. This is a few words about Moseley himself. Born in Weymouth, educated in Oxford and Manchester. And when World War I broke out, the centenary of that is next year, and that will be my sort of last thought, is looking ahead to the beginning of World War I. But he insisted on a commission. How many of you have watched Downton Abbey? Porchy insisted on a commission in World War I. He survived. Moseley did not. What else do we have here? Yes. His father was already dead at the time, but had gone on a Challenger expedition that developed a lot of understanding of how the ocean works before 1913. He went off, he was shot. I put Turkish in quotes because, like any war, World War I, who was on which side was not that simple. No one now alive knew Moseley. He died in 1915. But you can reach Moseley in one step several ways. He worked as a student with the younger Bragg, whom I knew, and he worked with the quite eccentric physicist Paul Adrien Maurice Dirac, whom I knew. So you can reach Moseley in two steps. And this does not bring any insight at all into why on earth he insisted on going into the trenches. But people did in those days. Yes, okay. Wallerstein's uncle. George Wallerstein is a very senior but very distinguished American astronomer. When I started rootling in this territory, he sent me an email saying that his uncle had received an Iron Cross from World War I. And as World War I wound down, the only way to avoid an Iron Cross in the German army was to be dead. Now, there was someone in the World War I German army who received the Iron Cross both first class and second class. It would have been better if he was dead. Who do I mean? Yes, everybody. Hitler, of course, yes. And when World War II broke out and the U.S. entered, a number of former Germans, German Americans, went to the office of the mayor of New York and handed over their Iron Crosses to be melted down for cannons. I love that story. Okay. This is not as far away as you might suppose in time. These people have left traces. That's a map only properly appreciated by Englishmen. Look at the relative sizes of England and Europe. Are those the right relative sizes? No, of course not. It's like the map of the United States that was on the cover of the New Yorker many years ago, with this great big Manhattan and this little taper of Hollywood and nothing else. But there is Europe as was seen by Moseley, where he was born, where he was educated, where he did his PhD. Incidentally, when you get a degree from an English university, an undergraduate degree, it can be a first class or a second class or without honors. Moseley got only a second class degree. He didn't get a first class degree, and yet he was recognized by Rutherford and others as enormously promising, and so he got a job immediately. There he is in the lab, looking rather gormless. There he is in uniform, looking also, I think, fairly gormless. And here we have the territory that I want to talk about. Scientists are territorial. If you have a colloquium series in your department, people will sit in the same seat every time the colloquium meets on Thursday afternoon or whenever it is. And if somebody is in your seat, you glare at them. And if you're in somebody else's seat, he will glare at you. Caltech, the whole front row at colloquia was reserved for very distinguished professors. And some poor child undergraduate who came and sat in the front row, the entire group of distinguished professors glared at him until he left. There were no undergraduate women at Caltech in those days, of course. But people are territorial, from tiny things like, who's been studying my nebula and left dust all over it? My PhD dissertation was on the Crab Nebula. And infrared astronomers later came along and said there was dust there. And I analyzed a different set of data, plates taken in the 30s, 40s, and 50s by Fritz Zwicky. And yeah, there was some dust there, so they were right. But they trespassed on my nebula without permission. That's very wicked. Okay. And there was a time when the chemists said, well, spectroscopy, spectra is physics. After all, it was done by Newton. And then the spectra was chemistry, Bunsen and Kirchhoff. And the astronomers were angry. And it was remarked that maybe you could use this to find out about the chemical composition of planets and stars, but this was of no proper astronomical interest. The person who said that in those words was George Airy, who was the guy who couldn't be bothered to go out and look for Neptune when it was predicted. It was also Simon Newcomb. Simon Newcomb was, at the turn of the previous century, probably the most distinguished astronomer in the United States. He was the founding president of the American Astronomical Society. He was director of the U.S. Naval Observatory. And it is widely thought, and I think probably correctly, he was the model for Professor Moriarty. Who was Professor Moriarty? Okay, I'm hearing mumbles of Sherlock Holmes. A few people might say Watson or Adrian Conan Doyle, but Moriarty wrote a paper on the dynamics of an asteroid, and so did Professor Newcomb. In any case, then in due course, astronomy was invaded by nuclear physics, and recently has been invaded by particle physics, with ideas like extra dimensions and brains and strings and multiverses, not on the whole welcomed. But conversely, astronomy has tried to force its way into physics and chemistry, and never welcomed, sometimes wrong, sometimes right. One of the really wrongers. Quasars were discovered just 50 years ago. That's one of my other anniversaries on one of the long lists there. And there will be meetings in December marking the discovery of quasars and the first Texas symposium. But it was clear immediately, quasars had enormous redshifts. If those redshifts were distance indicators, the steady state universe was wrong. Nobody ever gives up a scientific idea. I think it was Planck who said that. The only reason that some ideas fade away is that their supporters are all dead. The main supporters of steady state are now all dead.